My stream is telling me that there's 2 people watching. So I will start talking about what I'm doing. Otherwise I'll just be talking to myself. So what I'm doing at the moment is, the last few streams have been very much like this. I have about, I don't know, 800 sprites that I have to convert into sprite sheets. Not all of them have to be converted, but the game had about 800 and something different sprites. So I've been basically putting these sprite sheets together. So here you can see there's, you know, sprites for the player and whatnot, and everything is everything gets arranged on a 16 by 16 grid, because most of the sprites in the game are 16 by 16, and then I come along and I kind of shunt them into sprite grids. So this purple grid is a sprite grid, like the size of a Commodore 64 sprite. So we've got to import them first of all and make sure they all line up properly, and then convert them all to so they have the correct spacing. And then we take the bitmap image and export it into SpritePad. That creates sprites, and we export it into data statements effectively, and that gets included in the code. So it's quite a process to get it from GameMaker into the 64. Now you could say, well, Andy, you're a clever fella, why don't you write a program that takes all the sprites and automatically generates sprite sheets? But in any given sprite directory, any given folder, the sprites aren't necessarily in the correct order because they all have a unique ID number. So let's pull up the bull. I can show you what I mean. This is the bull from the minute source code. I'll zoom out a bit there. And it has all the different frames in there for the bull, and they have these really unique 25-digit bizarre numbers. And if I open up the information file, this tells GameMaker what order to run the sprites in and all the various properties and whatnot. And here it gives me the ID number for each sprite. So what I need to do is, using this as a guide, drag the sprites in order, arrange them properly, and then bring them across into my sprite sheet. Another aspect too is, because there's so many little graphics and images and whatnot, it would be so difficult to know what those images are for and how they work and all that kind of stuff. So effectively what I'm doing in the process of bringing the sprites across is I'm also learning about how those sprites work, how the animations fit together, how many different sets of images there are for different entities, how many states there are for different entities. Like, say for example, the main player, he has a whole bunch of different states: idle, climb, walk, hurt, swim, hurt while swimming, climb, you know, a whole different range. So it's useful for me to examine those frames. And plus the other thing too is certain frames, like the bull, if I bring in the bull, excuse me, he's somewhat bigger than 16 by 16. He's actually 32 by 32. So with a bit of judicious trimming, he will fit into Commodore 64 sprites. I think that would work actually. If I just bring them across, turn on my sprite grid. So he would actually fit, he'd have to be split across 2 sprites. Yeah, he would fit just about, without, we'd have to trim off a little bit of his shadow, but it's not too much of a major sacrifice. So yeah, not all the sprites are the same size, and also there's a lot of miscellaneous images in there, like tile sets and stuff like that. So at the moment, it sort of makes sense to do these by hand. I may get, you know, 100 sprites in, get ridiculously bored. But I think I've got the main ones so far. So far I've done about 42, and then there's a whole bunch of other sprites and whatnot. Another thing too is these mask sprites, which aren't needed, but these are basically collision masks that get used so the player doesn't collide with, for example, the bull sprite. It collides with the mask. I can show you what I mean by bringing in a bull. So what I believe happens here, paste him in the middle, and I'll change. So I've changed that mask sprite to red, just to kind of show you what's going on here. So when the ball charges towards the player, if the player hits, you know, this horn, or, you know, these parts of the ball, anything outside of the red area, the player wouldn't collide with. And the masks, I think, that does get used on, 16-bit games and things like that. All the Amiga games used to use masks quite a bit. So it's almost surprising to see them being used here, but it does give you a lot more precision over collision and all that kind of stuff. We won't be using the masks. I don't think we use them at all. I think every object in the game basically has a little mask. Yeah, we won't be doing any of that kind of stuff. We'll be writing our own collision system. First of all, yes, the music you can hear in the background is the Minute soundtrack by Jukio Kallio, and that's available on Spotify. I think it's also up on Bandcamp. It's quite a nice little soundtrack, and if you've played the game, you know, it's also pretty cool to listen to, because it kind of makes you think of, you know, various areas. You'll hear a tune and you'll think, ah, right, I remember that bit, or I remember getting stuck in that dungeon, or I remember dying there 50 times. But yeah, as I'm doing Minute sprites, I thought I would put on the Minute soundtrack for some added atmosphere and see what's going on. But yeah, if you're watching, feel free to kind of drop me a message in the chat, say something, let me know who you are, so I don't feel like I'm being stalked. And yeah, if you have any questions about what I'm doing, or questions about Minute 64 in general, or anything, just ask me a question. It's just a quick stream for today, so I'm probably going to be here for about maybe half an hour more, just to test out the stream quality, because this is the first time I've done restricted streams via YouTube, because typically I was using Twitch, but Twitch doesn't let you do private streams. I don't know why, and because we want these streams to be Patreons only, we had to shift over to YouTube. But yeah, feel free to drop me any questions. I'm going to crack on and do the bull, I think. So I like the look of the bull. So I'm just going to bring him across and drag all my sprites in. And I will have this handy, crazy 20-digit number, so it's kind of, you can get away with just reading the first few digits, but it is a bit of a confusing mess, especially when some of them are quite similar. And the good thing about this as well is it's it's not difficult work. It's, I mean, depending on your anger level, I find it reasonably therapeutic. And there are other things that I need to do on the game at the moment, but this gives me a nice break. The fact that there's such a huge volume of graphics to plow through means that you can continually switch from one to the next if you get bored, which is quite handy. And sometimes that isn't possible, and you just pretty much gotta wade through, but this is thankfully that point in the project where there's a billion things to do and they're all equally important. So on the one hand, while I could be working on the map, I do want to work on some sprites too, because we're in the process of organizing the map, but also simultaneously organizing the sprite banks but generally speaking, the longer development sessions that are like 3 or 4 hours, that tends to be me working on the more intense stuff where I need to think a lot more and pay attention and whatnot. And this is my bull that I've just pulled across. And you can see that he's wagging his tail. So what I do is I then take this multi-layered image and I then pull it into my master document that has everything laid out. And he is going to be arranged basically he's going to be in the same position in every frame. So what I'm basically doing is I'm counting pixels as I shift him across to make sure he's properly aligned to the grid, because otherwise the animations will just go and you'll see it shift. So it's worth investing the time at this point in time to make sure. But I think going back to the original, he was always aligned to that edge, which is handy. So that's the first strip of sprites, is the bull. And eventually what will happen is I will duplicate this down into another row of sprites, and I will separate that out into white sprites and black sprites, because effectively what you see right there can't be done on a Commodore 64. You need to overlay, I mean, he's going to be 4 sprites overlaid, which is, it's lucky there's nothing else on the screen at the same time as him, because the player takes up 4 sprites. So he's going to be 4 hardware sprites, and so for each sprite you're going to have, for each frame rather, you're going to have a white bit and then the black outline. And some of the sprites we can get away with. I think a lot of the NPCs, which are basically going to be plotted as directly onto the bitmap image, we don't need a black outline because they're going to be on black mainly. And yeah, so we don't really have to worry about that kind of stuff. But for this and anything that's basically going to be a Commodore 64 hardware sprite has to be split into its component parts, which once you do that, the sprite sheet gets a little bit confusing, because then they have to be merged together. You have to take all your black sprites and your white sprites and merge them together. so that the game can pick up, okay, these next two frames go together, these next two frames go together, rather than have all the white and all the black separately. We integrate. See? Racial. As David Brent would say. So yeah, we basically we lay our sprites out in a particular way, which makes it just easier and more efficient on the coding side. To basically say, sprite 1 is your frame, but sprite 2 is, you're basically just adding 1 to a variable to get the mask that goes behind it. So if you didn't follow any of that, just let me know in the chat and I can explain a little bit slower. So the next bit is the ball charge. This is the sprite sequence when he's charging, believe it or not. So I'm just going to drag these frames in. That's all his frames. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, so then what I do is that's the first frame in my sequence. And I take the second frame, copy it right to the first frame. And we use paste in place rather than just paste it in, which would just paste it in the center of the image. And use paste in place so it remembers its exact position, which is essential for animations. And it sounds like I know what I'm doing, but let's just say for the first couple of sprites. I did mess it up quite badly and had to redo some work, but that thankfully wasn't being streamed, so now from what I see here, it looks as though the just pop a background layer in here. It looks as though there's a little bit of white stuff coming out of the back of the bull, and that's not that's not bull's milk. That is the dust cloud that he leaves behind. So we go back here, we see that I've got his bum aligned more or less to the back end of the sprite, which basically leaves no room for his dust cloud. So I need to shunt me balls. Basically they should probably be aligned to that side of the sprite, and then that leaves space in the second sprite for the bull milk. So let me turn that layer off. I'm going to drag these guys across here. From what I see, just organizing my layers a little better. One of the really important things that I do here is I label all my layers. If you know any lazy graphic artists, you'll see that their layers are called whatever Photoshop gives them. So you could have a layer called layer 55 copy, and you have no idea what that is. And it's always good practice to label your layers and your groups. And normally I wouldn't bother on smaller projects, but this project file is going to have a lot of layers, and So I basically name my layers after the, based on the folder name. So if I want to find the bull charge, it's fairly easy to find that within the Photoshop document. So it's kind of essential to stay organized. But this, go back to this project, it doesn't look like, I'm basically checking the alignment down the side. I want to make sure that his horn is basically in the same position, same horizontal position on every frame, which it looks like it is, which is lucky, because that makes it easier to lay out. Normally I just kind of count pixels as I tap, but this, thankfully, is going to be a fairly easy sprite to lay out. And as we can see, there's space left behind him for the little dust cloud from his are they hooves or hoofs or bull feet? So yeah, so that's that particular sequence. And the beauty of this, of course, is the fact that this, even though this little cloud of dust doesn't have an outline, it's still part of one of the overlaid sprites. So there's nothing additional there that concerns me. Right now I'm just basically trying to get all these hundreds of separate images into a single sprite sheet. So he looks like he's done. That looks like the bull charge is okay. And as I was saying earlier, these sprites are slightly bigger than a 64 sprite. So as you can see, it goes off the bottom here. He's just a little bit too tall. So what will ultimately happen is this additional layer at the bottom, this additional pixel, will get trimmed because it's just a shadow underneath the bull. It's not essential. You're never going to miss that pixel. You're never going to see it in game. Even if you had the two games side by side, the original and the 64 version, you wouldn't say, hold on a second, there's a pixel of shadow missing from that bull. And most of the screens have a black background anyway, so you're never going to notice it. And you may find in retrospect, when we come to actually implement that screen, if the bull never crosses in front of scenery, which I'm not sure he does, he runs into walls, but I don't think he overlaps the scenery. And if he doesn't, we would potentially be able to whittle him down to just a couple of sprites. If the player always goes in front of him, so that we never see the player go behind him, and therefore, you know, the missing outline becomes apparent. But yeah, so that's the bull charge. So what I should do up here is I should also put in a, just going to group these together. What I should probably do is I basically start making an additional layer which has all the, in the minute font too, see, detail. I basically include the name of the animation, so ultimately, I mean, I would line it all up a little bit better, but these master sprite sheets, I basically send to the programmer John Wells. I send them to him as a reference. So rather than him just get a sprite sheet with a sequence of a dozen sprites and he doesn't know what it's for, I send him a reference sheet too, which shows him all the sequences laid out, all the different frames. If there's a blank frame, we just color that blue. And these little labels by the side are useful for him as a reference. So the next one up is the bull dazed. And I would imagine that's just going to be a sort of looped sequence. I'm just going to save that document out. Make sure nothing untoward happens to me data. So the bull dazed. Let me drag in the sprites for this. I mean, it's an easier process when you're not talking and streaming, because I tend to listen to more ambient music that helps me work faster, and I'm not having to explain everything that I'm doing or feel like I have to talk. And these aren't necessarily the most riveting live streams, but it is a chance for people to ask questions and not interrupt the serious stuff. And the other thing too is it will get a bit more interesting as time goes on, and you get to see more of the process of taking these graphics and putting them in the game. And once we have the event system figured out for the game, then I'll be doing a lot of streams where I'm basically taking each screen in turn and putting in the animations, and then exporting the data and testing it out in the game, making sure the animations work and stuff like that. So that will be a bit more interesting than this stuff, partly because there's a lot more potential for stupid mistakes and things to go wrong, which can sometimes be funny, you know. It does have its moments. I'm just going to quickly paste these buggers in. Just do it as quickly as I can because it's not the most riveting stuff. Copy pasting. And this is where, obviously, of course, knowing your keyboard commands, keyboard shortcuts, comes in ridiculously useful, because you're not continually going up to menus, blah blah blah. And Photoshop is a bit laborious if you don't know the shortcut, or if there isn't a shortcut, and there are many situations where it's quite tedious. If I examine this sequence one by one, you can see there's a frame there where his horns do come in slightly. And then presumably so for the last 4 frames of the sequence, his horns, the first 4, his horns are in one position, and then in the last 4 frames there's a 1 pixel gap down the side. So knowing that in advance, this is a crazy track. These are all from this track is from the jukebox in the game. It's basically a puzzle where you can, maybe I shouldn't give it away. These are from the jukebox in the game. There we go, that's all I'm going to say. Let's start that again. I'm not really a fan of the jukebox tracks. They're a bit too, well, they work in the game, but they don't necessarily make the best listening. So the bull, poor old little bull, he's a bit dazed and confused in this particular sequence. Just dragging him. After a while you can get pretty zen with this too. And before you know it, before you know it, you've done a million sprites. first 4 frames, oops. Yeah, so the first 4 frames are touching the edge of the sprite, and then the next 4 where he kind of brings his horns in, they're not. So you can see over time, there's a, this is just for one bull. He is a bit of an exception to a rule though, because most enemies in the game are fairly small. They are 16 by 16, but him being a bull, he is supposed to be massive. So he is going to take up a lot of sprites. And however many frames you see there, so 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 22 sprites. Oh, 22 frames, it's going to be 44, 88 sprites just for that. And we are quite limited on our sprite memory because we're using bitmap mode, which takes up a big chunk of the graphics bank, that particular bank. So the likelihood is for this little fella, his animations are going to be copied in on the fly, which we can do because we have a cartridge. So we can effectively just stop everything, literally copy in a whole chunk of data quite quickly because it's cartridge, and then we carry on and the player is none the wiser. So a lot of people have asked along the way, why aren't you doing a Spectrum version? And that's one key reason, is the amount of graphics data that's in the game. If we're going to do this authentically, which I want to do, then we want to replicate stuff as precisely as we can. As soon as you get into the realms of cutting things down in size, you affect the gameplay, and you also then have to go back to the people who made the original game and say, is this okay with you? We've changed this, does this look okay? Does this function okay? Does this feel the same? So a Spectrum version is possible, but it would be, there would be a ton of work involved just trimming everything down. There'd be a ton of work back and forth with the license holders. It's one of the keys with licensed games is you stick as close as you possibly can to the source material, because then you're not going through this process of having stuff approved, which is just a huge time sink for everybody involved. So I'm just gonna maybe do one more. Actually, no, I've got time to do a couple more. So this is the next one is the bull getting hurt, which in most cases a minute is just basically creating a flash frame. So effectively, oops, not labeling my layers. One second. Nope. Okay. So this one is the ball getting hurt. So the second frame is basically. Oops. Yeah. So the second frame is basically. First frame is basically blacked out, and the second frame is. Kind of closed eyes sort of sprite. But like I said, had we just created strips out of these automatically, yes, it would have been faster, but this helps me really understand, like I said, the different states of the ball, the animations that are required, how we might squeeze that down, I say, for instance, on this full sequence here, we could potentially, this dazed sequence, we could potentially do that another way, because he basically has stars above his head. He doesn't really do much. He only has 2 poses. So if we ran out of space sprites time, and we still had the inclination, we could go through and refine these, but it lets me understand the animations a lot more, and it also helps me when I'm implementing the events, get the sequences right, get the frames right, get the timing right. Like I really need to understand how the art is put together. But that said, I am wondering if an automated system might be helpful. It would be an awful lot of dragging and rearranging, because the automated system wouldn't know how they should be arranged, which is the key problem. Like some things you can automate, but you just need that human intervention. So I'm going to finish off the stream today with 9586, the bull's run sequence. Okay, so this is a relatively straightforward sequence. Just 4 frames, which is probably looped in the game. The data file isn't telling me anything special. Let me just... Okay, if I can close that down. So this is the bull's little run sequence. And fingers crossed. So he always stays aligned to the left-hand side. Oops. Photoshop just showing you how slow it is. So we have an issue here in, let me just, so this is bull. So if I go back to the original just for one moment, we have an issue in the sense that he does go over the sprite limit. He does go over the boundaries. So he is a classic situation where you think everything is plain sailing, which it has been up until now. So this is a situation where he is, in fact, quite big. So far it's been, oh great, he fits within, we can trim off the pixel shadow and then he fits within the sprite. But here, you get to this part and you go, bugger. And this is essentially game development 101, is every day, multiple times, you're going to deal with a fire like this. This is a creative fire, and you can't just put the fire out, you have to put the fire out with an equal amount of creativity. So some problems like this aren't particularly difficult to solve, some aren't particularly easy to solve. So for this one I've got no idea, but right now it's not going to affect me or slow me down. I'm just going to keep going on in blind ignorance. The likelihood is his horns might have to be made a bit smaller. But then you get into realms of a lot of work, because then you've got to change every single frame. But there are potentially as well ways that we can offset the sprites. So rather than have two sprites side by side and the sequence runs within them, we could actually create also not just an animation table, but a table of positions for those sprites. And then that way, by a little bit of judicious jostling and a couple of pixel tweaks here and there on just his run sequence, we could probably get that to fit in. But on the flip side, that's extra code to store those offsets. So we shall have to wait and see. And I think that's it for the bull, actually. We have a bull charge, full dazed. Bull hurt. Run. And that's that. And on the flip side as well, like some of the folders in this game include literally just a single image, and this is for the bushes in the game. So some of those images are going to be relatively easy to pop down on the master sheet. But essentially, that's my task for the next month or so, is to basically get everything arranged on big sheets for John, and then we start chopping it up and splicing it up. But that's all there is for today, and I promise the next stream will be a little bit more interesting. I'll try not to do sprites next time. I'll try and maybe show you the next current build of the game or something like that. But yeah, so that's about it for now, and I will catch you next time. Cheers.